But if in thinking, moving from that, what is really essential to what are the steps for leading change, I find it helpful to go back to one of my favorite authors around change management, John Cotter, who wrote a book several years ago now called Leading Change. And he was talking about big change, not necessarily quality improvement kind of change in a practice, but in thinking about this, I thought it was a really helpful framework, granted with some accommodation, some maybe editing of some of these comments. But whether you're talking about leading a big cultural change, a social movement, a political change, or I would suggest quality improvement kind of change, I think that these steps can be very helpful. So I'm going to just use this framework to walk through. So one, establish a sense of urgency. In medical practice, healthcare today, I would suggest that the survivability of practice is a strong element of that sense of urgency, right? So we don't have to go too far for practices to understand that they absolutely have to engage in a process of quality improvement or changing who they are, right, to survive in today's environment. Whether those are changing and rising, truthfully, expectations for performance, for accountability, for outcomes, particularly in the context of ongoing value-based payment reform, and now the newest kid on the block, right, our friends MACRA-MIPS, the federal legislation that's about to be finalized into rule within the next month or so, and will be impacting their payment in 2019 based on their performance in January 2017, right, just a few months away. So if practices aren't aware of this yet, they're somewhere living under a rock, but we need to be able to help them get ready and not just scare them with this, right, but to really use those changes in the environment to help support the sense of urgency. I think also certainly recognizing the frustration with the status quo, right? Show me the business case for the status quo. What's really working here? We know there's a lot of frustration from clinicians, practice teams, and patients alike, as well as the payers, the real payers who are, to a large extent, both employers and ourselves as taxpayers, right? Paying for very expensive healthcare. So there are a lot of reasons to change our systems. It's not like we've got a great system right now that everybody's perfectly happy with. And then particularly, thinking how quality improvement can be a great opportunity to build professionalism, which we know that appeals to professionalism and ways to engage providers in professionalism is one great strategy to help prevent burnout and to really help keep folks engaged. So next step, form a coalition. Again, maybe not quite the same multi-stakeholder coalition if you're thinking about, trying to increase the tobacco tax in your community, but I would suggest within the practice you need a coalition too, right? There's no such thing as quality improvement run by one person. So, right, what's better to fail than when it's Mary's project or Chelsea's project, right? This really has to be an initiative that's owned by the team. So who's on your team? Again, thinking about if you're working with a practice or within a practice, who are the ones that really hold the resources all the way from the top, whether it's board, your president, medical director at your practice, to the operational management, who's making decisions about allocation of resources, to the frontline clinicians, the front office staff, right, who often have to implement some of these changes, and certainly, importantly, including patients as well, to move from something that is disorganized or reactive to proactive. So thinking again, either the folks you're working with or if you're leading a practice, the fundamental need to create your vision for this, right? It's not, gosh, we really need the MAs who are rooming the patients to take their shoes off, right, to do a diabetic foot check, and on top of everything else they're doing, right? But it's stepping back and saying, okay, we have identified that diabetes is a big issue in our community and a big issue in the population of patients we serve. We know that X% of people with diabetes go on to develop vascular disease and suffer from the amputation of the lower extremity. Well, what's the way to deal with that? Well, we need to increase our rate of foot checks, or whatever it is, just using a hypothetical example, right? But starting with that big picture, and I think many of us who are in this world, who do this work, we kind of forget that not everybody has the big picture, right? We sort of assume, well, of course you're going to do foot checks, or of course you're going to repeat the blood pressure after you checked it, or whatever issue you're working on, because we know the connection to the big picture, but the people we're working with might not, right? Whether that's the front office staff or the receptionist or the medical assistant or even the other clinician on your team, right? So starting with a big picture and having a systematic way for identifying your priorities, right? There's nothing that gets to people more to have one project, another project, another project with no real visibility for them on why did you pick that? Why did you pick hypertension control, or we're gonna start working on no-show appointments or improving access to care, right? So having a systematic way to do that and making it visible to the people that you're working with is an essential element of that. And then really trying to link the priorities, the specific quality improvement initiatives to that big picture, and doing it over and over and over, repeatedly explaining, right, that link to the big picture 6 ways, 6 times in different ways, and getting very specific about what we're working on, what are we trying to improve, by when, the old model for improvement, right? How do we know a change is an improvement? And I think another critical step along the way in there is really identifying the what's in it for me, the WIFM, right? So while again, it might be really important to somebody in the organization that one addresses no-show rates or improving access or clinical measure, there's got to be something in it for the person whom this is impacting, right? So we have got to figure out, first of all, what matters to practices and to whom in practices, recognizing that there are different models of practice ownership. Practices that are owned by hospitals or hospital-based health systems might have different incentives and drivers than those that are independently owned, which in our state is becoming less and less, or then community health centers or FQHCs that have a community board. We have to recognize that certain payment arrangements, whether they're still fee-for-service, which again, many of ours still are, even as we move towards volume-based payment arrangements, can have a big impact, right? If we're talking to providers about taking more time to do whatever XYZ step in an improvement process, but they know that every week on their chair, they're getting a report of their RVUs, the volume, right? We've got to recognize that and figure, okay, well then how do we make it this doable for them? And then obviously different incentives related to different specialty type as well. And I think that's one of the challenges in our PTN, as I suspect others, that there are very, very different audiences. So really understanding your audience and what's not only going to motivate them, but specifically what's in it for them in terms of this quality improvement. Not that they don't have the bigger picture of improvement or, you know, higher levels of motivation as well, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty change on the ground, really figuring out how is this going to make their life better, their day better, their payment systems better, whatever that is. In terms of communication, I mentioned we really have to do this over and over. So really thinking concretely, how are we going to communicate the vision and the plan? Again, identifying, understanding the audience, and identifying specific methods, right? Just announcing it in a meeting is clearly not enough. How can we get it into a presentation, whether that's to the staff, to the providers, maybe to the board of the organization? How can we get it repeatedly in front of folks through things like newsletters, posters, traditional or social media, and just remembering the 6 ways, 6 times, right? Once is not enough. Just because this is our job and we're doing it does not mean that they are remembering the importance of whatever task we're asking them to do, or again, that link to the big picture.